What happens when one of Hollywood's most stoic and uncompromising stars sits down for what should be a routine promotional interview, only to find himself locked in a verbal battle with daytime television's most confrontational host? The legendary Tommy Lee Jones, known for his intimidating screen presence and no-nonsense attitude, walked onto the set expecting to discuss his latest project, but instead found himself facing off against Joy Behar's relentless questioning that pushed the Academy Award winner beyond his limits. What started as typical Hollywood promotional banter quickly spiraled into a fiery debate that had audience members holding their breath and production staff desperately trying to regain control. The tension became so explosive that Jones did something that shocked everyone in the studio, something that left millions of viewers absolutely stunned. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because this heated confrontation will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about celebrity interviews. You're about to witness one of the most shocking and intimidating moments in daytime television history. Tommy Lee Jones, Hollywood's most uncompromising and stone-faced legend whose mere presence has commanded respect for over 4 decades, was about to face something that would test every ounce of his legendary restraint. The Academy Award-winning actor who has intimidated countless co-stars, directors, and journalists with his piercing stare and no-nonsense attitude, who has never backed down from anyone or anything in his entire career, was about to encounter a host who seemed determined to break through that impenetrable facade. For decades, Tommy Lee Jones has been the embodiment of old Hollywood toughness. He's navigated interviews with minimal words and maximum impact, handled difficult questions with stone-cold stares that could freeze blood, and always maintained the kind of intimidating presence that made even the boldest journalists think twice before pushing too hard. From his breakout roles to his Oscar-winning performances, Jones has built a reputation as someone you simply don't mess with. But on this particular morning at the View studio, Hollywood's most intimidating figure would face a different kind of challenge entirely. This wasn't going to be about his latest film, his incredible range from comedy to drama, or even his legendary work ethic. This was going to be a calculated assault on his character, his values, and his very right to exist as the uncompromising force he'd always been. What you're about to see isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This is a masterclass in what happens when someone mistakes television courage for real courage. When a host decides that attacking Hollywood's most intimidating figure makes for compelling entertainment. The man who has stared down aliens, outlaws, and some of cinema's most dangerous characters was about to show everyone exactly why his reputation for being uncompromising was both well-earned and absolutely justified. The View studio was about to become the scene of a confrontation that would be remembered as the day someone tried to intimidate the intimidator. The morning air felt charged with tension as Tommy Lee Jones arrived at ABC's Manhattan studios with his characteristic stone-faced intensity and intimidating presence. The legendary actor moved through the backstage corridors with that unmistakable economy of movement that had made him one of Hollywood's most formidable figures, his piercing eyes scanning every face with the kind of scrutiny that made even veteran crew members feel like they were being evaluated. "Morning," he said tersely to the production staff he encountered, his gravelly voice carrying just enough acknowledgement to be polite without wasting unnecessary words. There was something almost predatory about his awareness, like a seasoned gunfighter sizing up potential threats in an unfamiliar saloon. His publicist walked beside him with obvious nervousness, clutching her notes like a shield. "Tommy, remember they'll want to keep things light and promotional. Just focus on the film, maybe share a quick anecdote, and we could be out of here in 15 minutes. Jones nodded curtly, his weathered face showing no emotion beyond mild irritation at having to be there at all. "Keep it short," he replied in that distinctive Texas drawl. "I've got work to do." The makeup artist approached him with visible trepidation, clearly aware she was dealing with Hollywood's most notoriously difficult interview subject. "Mr. Jones, just some light touch-ups if that's okay." He sat motionless as a statue, his eyes fixed straight ahead with the kind of intensity that suggested he was already counting the minutes until he could leave. The studio fell to a respectful hush as Jones made his entrance, his commanding presence immediately filling the space with an almost palpable tension. The audience applauded cautiously, as if they understood they were in the presence of someone who demanded respect through sheer force of personality. He settled into the guest chair with the rigid posture of someone who was there under protest, his famous scowl already in place. Everything felt appropriately restrained for an actor who had built his career on being Hollywood's most uncompromising figure. But Joy Behar sat quietly watching, her expression suggesting she was about to test just how uncompromising he really was. "So, Tommy," Whoopi began with careful respect, "tell us about this new project. What drew you to this particular role?" Jones's weathered face remained impassive as he considered the question with that trademark deliberation that had made him legendary. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades in Hollywood and the kind of authority that commanded immediate attention. "It's a good story," he said with characteristic economy, his Texas drawl cutting through the studio like gravel. "Good director, good cast. That's all you need." The audience listened with rapt attention, clearly mesmerized by his understated presence and the way he could fill entire moments with just a few carefully chosen words. His hands remained perfectly still as he spoke, every gesture calculated and purposeful. "The character reminded me of people I grew up with," he continued, offering slightly more detail. "Men who didn't waste words, who let their actions speak for them. That's the kind of story worth telling." Throughout this measured exchange, Joy Behar had remained conspicuously silent. While the other hosts nodded respectfully at Jones's minimal but impactful responses, Joy sat back with her arms folded, studying him with an intensity that seemed to be calculating the perfect moment to strike. Finally, after several minutes of respectful discussion, Joy shifted forward in her chair. The movement was subtle, but it immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. Jones's piercing eyes fixed on her with laser-like focus, and the other hosts grew noticeably more tense. "Tommy," Joy said, her voice carrying a sharpness that cut through the careful respect that had defined the conversation, "I have to ask you about something that's been on my mind. You have quite a reputation in Hollywood for being difficult. Some people say you're intimidating to work with. Don't you think that kind of behavior is problematic in today's workplace environment?" The studio temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees, and Jones's famous scowl deepened as he processed this unexpected attack on his professional character. Jones's stone face remained impassive, but there was a subtle shift in his posture as he processed Joy's calculated attack on his professional reputation. His piercing eyes narrowed slightly, and when he spoke, his voice carried that menacing undertone that had made him one of cinema's most intimidating figures. "I have high standards," he replied with deadly calm, his words measured like bullets in a chamber. "If that makes me difficult, then I'm proud to be difficult. I don't coddle people who aren't serious about their work." Joy sensed she had found her opening and pressed forward with the aggressive instinct of someone who had identified what she thought was a vulnerable target. Her voice took on a sharper, more confrontational tone as she leaned into what was clearly becoming an interrogation rather than an interview. "But Tommy, don't you think there's a difference between having standards and creating hostile work environments?" she continued, her words dripping with accusation. "We've heard stories about your behavior on sets, about how you intimidate younger actors and crew members. Doesn't that kind of toxic masculinity belong in the past?" The other hosts exchanged deeply uncomfortable glances, clearly recognizing that Joy was venturing into territory that went far beyond professional discussion. Sarah attempted a nervous intervention, but Joy's focus remained laser-locked on Jones. Jones's legendary composure began showing its first visible cracks, his jaw tightening as his famous temper started to simmer beneath the surface. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice dropping to that dangerous register that anyone who had worked with him would recognize as a final warning. The studio audience could feel the tension building as the respectful promotional atmosphere rapidly dissolved into something much more personal and dangerous. Joy's predatory smile suggested she was just getting started with her systematic attack on Hollywood's most uncompromising legend. Joy's eyes gleamed with something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction, as she prepared to launch her most devastating attack yet. The pretense of discussing Jones's work had been completely abandoned, and everyone in the studio could sense that something far more personal and vicious was about to unfold. "Tommy, let's talk about what really concerns me," Joy said, her voice taking on a tone that made several audience members shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Your whole persona, this intimidating tough guy act, don't you think it represents everything that's wrong with traditional masculinity? Don't you think men like you are the problem with Hollywood's old boys club mentality?" The question hit the studio like a physical blow. The other hosts' faces showed immediate shock, and even the camera operators seemed to freeze. This was the kind of ideological attack that crossed every professional boundary, weaponizing Jones's very identity against him in the most confrontational way possible. Jones's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The stone-faced composure cracked, replaced by something much more intense and dangerous. His voice, when he spoke, carried a tremor of genuine fury that suggested Joy had just awakened something that had been dormant, but never truly asleep. "Lady, you don't know the first thing about me or what I represent," he said, his Texas drawl sharpening like a blade. "You're sitting there making assumptions about my character based on gossip and your own prejudices." But Joy had clearly decided that respect for his legendary status was irrelevant to good television. She leaned forward even more aggressively, her voice rising with what seemed like manufactured righteous indignation. "When you consistently portray these intimidating, emotionally closed-off characters, when you bring that same energy to your real-life interactions, aren't you perpetuating harmful ideas about what men should be? Isn't that kind of influence actually damaging to society?" The studio audience sat in stunned silence, witnessing what felt less like journalism and more like a public trial of Hollywood's most uncompromising figure. What happened next would become one of the most intimidating confrontations in daytime television history. Joy's attack on Jones's masculinity and values had pushed Hollywood's most uncompromising figure past every boundary of professional courtesy, and the legendary intensity that had made him famous was about to transform into something far more fierce and terrifying. "You want to talk about what's damaging to society?" Jones fired back, his voice rising with an intensity that made everyone in the studio freeze. "It's people like you who think they can tear down everything that represents strength, discipline, and personal responsibility just because it doesn't fit your narrow worldview." Joy's face flushed with anger as she shot up from her chair, clearly believing she could intimidate the intimidator. "Strength? Tommy, what you represent isn't strength. It's toxic masculinity disguised as professionalism. You intimidate people because you can't handle being challenged." Jones rose to meet her challenge, his presence filling the studio with an authority that was both magnetic and absolutely terrifying. At 6 feet tall, with decades of barely contained intensity, he towered over the situation with the kind of commanding presence that had made him legendary. "You think this is challenging me?" he said, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper that had made movie villains tremble. "Lady, you don't have the first clue what real strength looks like. You confuse loud with strong, aggressive with brave." The other hosts were completely paralyzed, afraid to intervene in what had become an all-out war between a television host and Hollywood's most intimidating figure. The studio audience watched in horrified fascination as the confrontation escalated beyond anything they had ever witnessed. "Your whole persona represents toxic masculinity," Joy shot back, her voice cracking as she realized she might have picked the wrong target. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of what would become the most uncomfortable and personally devastating exchange in television history. The silence that followed Jones's intimidating presence, towering over Joy, felt like it stretched on forever. The legendary actor stood there, his piercing eyes boring into her with decades of accumulated intensity, his legendary restraint hanging by the thinnest of threads. When he finally spoke, his voice carried that unmistakable Texas steel that had made him Hollywood's most feared figure. "You just made the biggest mistake of your pathetic career," he said, his words cutting through the studio like a scythe. You think you can sit there and lecture me about masculinity? You don't know what real strength is because you've never had to earn anything through actual work. Joy realized she had awakened something far more dangerous than she had bargained for. But instead of backing down, she made one final, desperate attack. Tommy, maybe Hollywood needs fewer men like you intimidating everyone around them. Fewer men like me? Jones's voice exploded through the studio with a force that made everyone recoil in genuine fear. This industry was built by men like me who showed up, did the work, and didn't whine about every little thing that hurt their feelings. You want to know what's toxic? It's people like you who tear down everyone who's actually accomplished something. He began removing his microphone with swift, controlled movements that somehow seemed more threatening than any explosion of rage. Joy watched in growing terror as she realized her attack had completely backfired. You can't just march off when someone holds you accountable, she called out desperately, her voice now noticeably shaking. Jones turned to face her one final time, and the look in his eyes was pure, concentrated intimidation. Lady, the only thing you've held accountable today is your own ignorance. With that, Tommy Lee Jones marched off the set with the same commanding presence that had made him a legend, leaving Joy standing alone and visibly shaken by what she had just unleashed. The silence that engulfed the View studio after Tommy Lee Jones's intimidating exit was unlike anything the crew had ever experienced. It was the kind of profound, uncomfortable quiet that follows an encounter with genuine force. When everyone present realizes they've just witnessed someone who had tried to intimidate the most intimidating man in Hollywood and failed spectacularly. The only sounds were the mechanical hum of cameras still rolling and the nervous whispers of audience members who looked genuinely shaken by what they had just witnessed. Joy stood frozen in place, her face pale and her earlier confidence completely evaporated. When she finally spoke, her voice lacked its usual aggression, replaced by something that sounded almost frightened. Well, she said, attempting to regain some semblance of control, I think that reaction proves exactly what I was talking about. Some people can't handle being questioned about their behavior. But her trembling hands and the slight shake in her voice told a different story entirely. The other hosts looked genuinely disturbed, their expressions suggesting they couldn't believe what they had just witnessed, and more importantly, what Joy had just unleashed. The studio audience sat in stunned silence, many appearing visibly intimidated by the raw intensity they had just experienced. Several audience members could be heard whispering, "She picked the wrong guy, and he's terrifying," their voices carrying clearly in the unnaturally quiet studio. The production crew stood frozen, knowing they had just captured something that would be remembered as one of the most intimidating moments in television history. This wasn't just a bad interview. This was the moment when someone learned the hard way that some legends earned their reputations for very good reasons. What you just witnessed wasn't just an interview gone wrong. It was a masterclass in what happens when someone confuses television bravado with real intimidation. And Tommy Lee Jones's march from that studio wasn't just an exit. It was a reminder that some people simply cannot be intimidated, no matter how hard you try. And that's how Hollywood's most intimidating legend went from reluctant guest to terrifying force of nature in less than 20 minutes. All because Joy Behar decided that trying to intimidate Tommy Lee Jones was more important than respecting one of cinema's most uncompromising figures. Jones's march from that studio wasn't just a walkout. It was a reminder that some people have earned their fearsome reputations and shouldn't be tested. The question is, do you think Joy was justified in challenging Jones's tough guy persona? Or did she learn the hard way that some legends are legendary for a reason? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure you subscribe for more moments that show what happens when television hosts bite off more than they can chew. Until next time, remember, never try to intimidate the intimidator.